Hi, Lester, Wisher Engineer. I trust that you're all keeping well and safe in the midst of this worldwide event that YouTube just doesn't want me to talk about. Stay strong. My friend, who is a local police officer and also a damn legend of a tabletop role-playing GM, approached me some time ago to do a bit of an investigation, a practical investigation for him. As it turned out, he had been saddled with a case involving a dispute between two road users, one driving a conventional car and the other driving a horse and buggy. The car driver had been driving dangerously close behind the buggy driver and had been hooting and trying to overtake, while the buggy driver had desperately tried to control his animals, who were obviously getting agitated by the person in the car. The car driver finally managed to perform a dangerously close overtaking maneuver. The exasperated and angry buggy driver then cracked his whip at the windshield of the car as it drove past. After the incident, the person in the car claimed that the buggy driver's whip had cracked his windshield. That is what my friend asked me to investigate. He asked me to investigate whether it was possible for a whip to actually crack a glass windshield. So I agreed, and I began preparing materials for my video investigation. A whip is a very interesting device because the sharp report that's typically heard when a whip is cracked is actually a tiny sonic boom. The very tip of the whip actually travels faster than the speed of sound, and that's what causes the cracking sound. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but the physics and maths behind this phenomenon are actually not simple to describe, and it would take a whole presentation of its own to do it justice. And I'm probably not the right person to do it anyway. For those who are interested, I found a paper entitled "The Propagation of Waves Through a Cracking Whip" by Jefferson Taft, which was quite a good little article. The abstract states the following: the properties involved in a cracking whip are explored. The goal is to provide a starting point for the exploration of this phenomenon. Eventually, scientists would like to produce an equation which describes the shape of the whip with respect to space and time. Some preliminary results are discussed in the paper. I would encourage all of those who are interested to track this paper down and read it. But for the sakes of putting an overly simplified explanation on the table for the purposes of this video, a whip can be seen to act like a long, flexible chain of elements with small, discrete mass. In some of the more advanced whip designs, such as bullwhips for instance, that mass actually decreases along the length of the whip towards the tip. When a whip is cracked, a wave or pulse is set traveling along the length of the whip, while the user simultaneously continues to accelerate the movement of the whip by pulling back on the whip. This increase in velocity increases the kinetic energy of the individual moving elements. In addition, in the more complex whips with decreasing mass along the length, the mass of the moving elements also decreases as the energy in the pulse increases. This decrease in mass means that the momentum transfer between elements causes the velocity of each successively lighter element to increase somewhat. All of this in combination causes the final velocity of the tip as it reacts to the pulse traveling along its length to be incredibly high, breaking the sound barrier. Yes, I acknowledge that this is a somewhat flawed and oversimplified explanation, but it will do for the purposes of this video. So I was quite interested in seeing whether an unmodified whip could develop sufficient velocity at the tip to crack glass through its sheer kinetic energy alone. This is of course not the true objective of the study, because the objective would not actually preclude modifications made to the whip. It's unknown whether the buggy driver had actually modified his whip, and it's quite possible that he had. This was just my personal additional objective to see whether it was possible for just the kinetic energy alone to crack the glass. There's apparently still a culture in some circles of modifying the tips of whips by knotting, or perhaps inclusion of other materials such as beads, bone, or even metal. The practice of adding material to the tips of whips is very ancient, but outside of the scope of this video. There are also many different types of specialist whip designs in use around the world for different purposes, all of which rely on modifying the velocity and energy of the tip of the whip to varying degrees. An example is this sjambok, or what's called a sjambok, which is a type of specialist whip used in South Africa, traditionally made from adult hippopotamus or rhinoceros hide. This one isn't, but traditionally it was. And plastic versions of this are actually like this one, a plastic version like this one. These are still in use today. So the example that I just showed you was a product made by Cold Steel, and it's actually made of polypropylene. In fact, Wikipedia indicates the following regarding the sjambok. A plastic version was made for the South African Police Service and used for riot control. The sjambok was heavily used by the voortrekkers during their driving their oxen while migrating from the Cape of Good Hope, and remains in use by herdsmen to drive cattle. They're widely available in South Africa, from informal traders to regular stores, from a variety of materials, lengths and thicknesses. They are an effective weapon to kill snakes and ward off dogs and other attackers, and are still carried in public by many South Africans for self-defense. Now, during my investigation into more conventional whips, I looked around to see if there were any examples of whip experts cracking substantial glass objects with their whips. Unfortunately, although there were some amazingly skillful demonstrations out there, I couldn't find any examples of this, which would have been sufficient evidence to indicate that the car driver's claim was at least plausible. However, after a couple of weeks of investigation, my friend indicated that something else had come up in the case, which had cast a very bad light on the driver of the car, and essentially made further investigation redundant. Anyway, I was still interested in doing a bit of an investigation, but the urgency had abated, and I didn't have the budget to go purchasing a well-made whip to do the testing with. A couple of weeks ago, I decided to resurrect the project and to build a couple of very simple whips to test this. So I constructed these. Essentially just two lengths of PVC pipe with some paracord on the ends, which were the flexible portions of the whips. One of them, this one, I allowed the tip to fray, as you can see, and the outer sheath to retract somewhat. And this whip you can use to crack in the traditional way. The other whip I used as a bit of a test platform to test various materials and end pieces. As a target, I used some glass jars, which were substantial enough that, if broken, would certainly lend plausibility to the fact that a whip could crack glass. I want to be quite honest with you about my whip cracking skills. I'm not a whip cracking expert. As such, my skill level or lack thereof should be considered a major study limitation. If I were more skilled with a whip, the results could very well have been different. In fact, that leads me to an open invitation to any of my viewers who consider themselves to be skilled whip users. Encourage you to try this experiment with a proper whip and see if you can refute my results. Of course, the other study limitation was that the whips I used were not properly made whips. If I'd had the budget and I bought a well-made whip, perhaps the results would also have been quite different. I first tried cracking the jar using the whip that had no hard tip, and this is what the test looked like. so I could not crack the glass with this whip. Next, I tried with the other whip using just a knotted tip. That's what I'm trying to avoid.
You had a bit of metal at the end, it probably would.
Yeah.
Very good,
Still no dice. So I decided to up the ante and attached a very small brass nut. In fact, the smallest that I could find that would still fit the paracord. And this is what happened. Well, that was quite dramatic. Success. Though dramatic, the result was not surprising in any way. I then ran some experiments using various other hard tips, including a glass fiber tubular sleeve and a tiny ceramic grinding media bead glued onto the tip. All of these other tests failed, although I strongly believe that my setup and skill may have heavily impinged upon the success of the tests. Anyone who's been driving along behind another vehicle and has had that vehicle kick up a tiny stone that cracked your windshield would know that a tiny, hard object traveling at sufficient velocity can certainly crack glass. I was just not able to replicate this with the whip. I was a bit disappointed in the results, and I may revisit this test at some time in the future. I believe, based on the results, that a whip with a modified tip can certainly be used to crack glass. Although I only achieved success using a metallic tip, I still feel that it is possible using a whip with a ceramic, stone, or even a bone tip. Perhaps someone with more skill and a better setup than I have might be able to prove the possibility of cracking a glass jar using an unmodified whip. I would be very interested in seeing this if you wanted to do some science on behalf of the Wushu Engineer channel. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all next time. Cheers!